11. The Battle of the Yen.
日元之战，
The powers of MOF.
财政部的权力。
Until 1998, Japan's Ministry of Finance controlled, legally speaking, most aspects of economic life in Japan. It controlled taxes through the National Tax Agency and the Tax Bureau, the government budget through the Budget Bureau, government bond issuance via the Finance Bureau, foreign exchange intervention and international capital flows through the International Finance Bureau, imports and exports through the Customs Bureau, securities transactions via the Securities Bureau, and the banking sector via the Banking Bureau. For good measure, the Ministry of Finance prints government documents and even the paper money issued by the Bank of Japan at its printing bureau. The central bank pays a small fee for this. But the ministry merely acts as a printer and has no say over the quantity printed.
直到1998年，日本的财政部在法律上控制着日本经济生活的大部分方面。它通过国家税务局和税务局控制税收，通过预算局控制政府预算，通过财务局发行政府债券，通过国际财务局干预外汇和控制国际资本流动，通过海关局控制进出口，通过证券局处理证券交易，以及通过银行局管理银行业。此外，财政部还在其印刷局印制政府文件，甚至日本银行发行的纸币，中央银行为此支付了少量费用，但财政部仅作为印刷者，并无权决定印刷数量。
MOF's power was exerted through formal rules as much as through informal guidance. Some were published as tsutatsu, administrative ordinances, while some were unwritten, extra-legal traditions handed down over generations of bureaucrats. MOF influence seemed to permeate economic and political life because former finance bureaucrats obtained influential posts as heads of government financial institutions, public corporations, private banks, securities houses, large firms, or as politicians. A substantial number of Diet members are former finance ministry bureaucrats.
财政部的权力既通过正式规则施加，也通过非正式指导施加，有些被公布为通知、行政法规，而有些则是代代相传的未成文、超法规的传统。财政部的影响力似乎渗透到经济和政治生活中，因为前财政部官员在政府金融机构、公共公司、私人银行、证券公司、大公司，甚至成为政治家，都能获得有影响力的职位。相当数量的国会议员都是前财政部官员。
The law said, MOF is in control.
法律规定，财政部掌控一切。
Although monetary policy was implemented by the Bank of Japan, the laws gave the oversight to the Ministry of Finance. Legally, the highest decision-making organ at the Bank of Japan was the Policy Board, which, as we saw, was instituted in 1949 by the U.S. occupation to democratize the central bank and dilute the wartime character of its setup. Apart from the BOJ governor and deputy governor, the Policy Board also included outsiders. Policies were discussed and then voted on. The well-known truth, however, was that the board merely rubber-stamped decisions previously made by the Executive Board of the Bank of Japan, which was composed of BOJ staff and headed by the governor.
尽管货币政策是由日本银行实施的，但法律将监督权交给了财政部。从法律上讲，日本银行最高决策机构是政策委员会，正如我们所看到的，该委员会是在1949年由美国占领军设立的，目的是民主化中央银行，稀释其暂时性质。除了日本银行的行长和副行长外，政策委员会还包括外部人士。政策会被讨论，然后投票决定。然而，众所周知的事实是，委员会只是对日本银行执行委员会之前做出的决定进行橡皮图章式的批准，而执行委员会由日本银行的员工组成，并由行长领导。
It is generally accepted that decisions about lowering or raising the official discount rate, ODR, were made only in close consultations with the Ministry of Finance. That was not simply due to the informal power of MOF, but also perfectly legal, the Bank of Japan law, which established the responsibilities and competence of the Japanese central bank, stated that the Bank of Japan can be told what to do in most areas of its business by the Ministry of Finance. Article 42 put it bluntly, the Bank of Japan shall be under the supervision of the competent minister. Article 43, the competent minister may, if deemed particularly necessary for the attainment of the object of the Bank of Japan, order the bank to undertake any necessary business, or order alterations in the bylaws as well as other necessary actions. And Article 44, the competent minister may issue orders or take such actions as are necessary in the exercise of his supervision. And the list continues. In the first 47 articles of the Bank of Japan law that dealt with its rights and duties, the phrases, with the permission of the competent minister, or, in accordance with the prescriptions of the competent minister, appeared 29 times. Although the competent minister is the finance minister, in practice this has meant the highest-ranking MOF bureaucrat, namely, the vice minister of finance. Monetary policy was therefore made in accordance with MOF. This is not surprising, given the wartime origin of the law.
通常认为，关于降低或提高官方贴现率 （ODR） 的决定，只在与财政部密切磋商后才做出。这不仅仅是因为财政部的非正式权利，而且完全合法。日本银行法规定了日本中央银行的责任和权限。该法明确指出，日本银行在其业务的大部分领域都可以被财政部指导。第42条直言不讳地规定，日本银行应受到主管部长的监督。第43条，如果主管部长认为对实现日本银行的目标特别必要，他可以命令银行进行任何必要的业务，或者命令修改章程以及其他必要的行动。第44条，主管部长可以发布命令或采取在他的监督行使中必要的行动。这样的规定还有很多。在日本银行法的前47条中，涉及其权利和职责的部分，经主管部长许可或按照主管部长的规定这样的短语出现了29次。虽然主管部长是财政部长，但实际上这意味着最高级别的财政部官员及财政部副部长。因此，货币政策是按照财政部制定的。考虑到该法的战时起源，这并不令人惊讶。
MOF thought it was in charge.
财政部认为自己掌握了主导权。
In the post-war era, MOF frequently exerted direct influence over ODR policies. When the jurisdiction over foreign exchange intervention was even more clear-cut, as it is governed by the separate foreign exchange law, which grants sole authority for foreign exchange intervention to the Ministry of Finance. The Bank of Japan merely acts as the executive branch of MOF that implements whatever size foreign exchange intervention is decided by the International Finance Bureau at MOF. This is also why foreign exchange markets watch the actions of the flamboyant Vice Minister of International Finance, Isaac Sakakibara, so closely in the mid-1990s.
在战后时期，财政部经常直接影响 ODR 政策，对外汇干预的管辖权更为明确。因为它受到单独的外汇法的管辖，该法赋予财政部对外汇干预的唯一权威。日本银行只是财政部的执行部门，负责实施由财政部国际金融局决定的任何规模的外汇干预。这也是为什么外汇市场在1990年代中期如此密切地关注国际金融副部长神原英姿的行动。
Given these legal facts, there seemed little doubt to most observers MOF was in charge. The bubble was created by the Ministry of Finance through excessively low interest rates. From 1984 to 1989, an ex-MOF vice minister, Satoshi Sumida, was even governor of the Bank of Japan. The BOJ, with its professional knowledge, knew better, but given its weak legal position, it could not help implementing the wrong policies forced on it by the Ministry of Finance. Even the average salaryman now understands that in the 1980s, banks have been the key accomplices of speculators who squandered sums in excess of a quarter of annual national income. The banks are supervised by MOF, and MOF is their patron. During the 1990s, the Japanese weekly papers ran frequent stories about how MOF's banking supervisors dined and were entertained in hostess restaurants in exchange for leaks about when the next bank audit would occur. When MOF responded to the banking problems, which initially erupted in the Jusen, or housing loan institutions, by suggesting using more tax monies, its reputation was thoroughly tarnished. It seemed that the prosecution's case could be rested. Japan's economic policies were disastrous, and the culprit was MOF. Thus MOF had to be punished by being stripped of its powers and broken up.
鉴于这些法律事实，大多数观察者似乎毫无疑问，财政部掌握了主导权。泡沫是由财政部通过过低的利率创造的。从1984年到1989年，前财政部副部长筑田智史甚至担任了日本银行的行长。日本银行凭借其专业知识明白这一点，但由于其法律地位弱，无法不执行财政部强加的错误政策。即使是普通的上班族，现在也明白，在1980年代，银行是投机者的主要帮凶， 他们挥霍的金额超过了全国年收入的1/4。银行由财政部监管，财政部是他们的保护者。在1990年代，日本的周刊经常报道财政部的银行监管者在接受女主人餐厅的款待后，泄露下一次银行审计的事件。当财政部对银行问题最初在住宅贷款机构爆发作出回应，建议使用更多的税收资金时，其声誉彻底受损。看来，检方的案件可以休庭了。日本的经济政策是灾难性的，罪魁祸首是财政部，因此，财政部必须被剥夺权力并被打破。
Hiro Mino.
英雄三重野境。
This is similar to the picture painted of Yasushi Mino, governor of the Bank of Japan from December 1989 to 1994. When he came to power in 1989, he noticed that the monetary policies of his predecessor, the former MOF Vice Minister Sumida, were too loose. Mino hated the outcome. Japan, he lamented, was becoming a nation of haves and have-nots as landowners became extremely rich at the expense of ordinary employees. He decided to end the bubble and raised the official discount rate only a fortnight after becoming governor, delivering the infamous Christmas present of 1989. Asset prices, led by stock prices, began to tumble in 1990. They were still hitting new lows more than a decade later, in 2002. Land prices had come down by around 80% and were still falling in early 2002. 7 fat years of waste and distortions were followed by more than 7 lean years that sobered the economy.
这与描绘三重野境的画面相似。他在1989年12月至1994年期间担任日本银行行长。当他在1989年上台时，他注意到他的前财政部副部长筑田的货币政策过于宽松。三重野讨厌这个结果，他哀叹日本正在变成一个有的和没有的国家，因为地主们以普通员工的代价变得极其富有。他决定结束泡沫，并在上任仅2周后提高了官方贴现率，送出了1989年臭名昭著的圣诞礼物。资产价格以股票价格为首，开始在1990年下跌，到2002年，他们仍在创新低。土地价格已经下跌了大约80%，并在2002年初仍在下跌。7年的浪费和扭曲之后，是7年以上的寿年，使经济清醒过来。
A public dispute between Makoto Utsumi, the MOF Vice Minister of International Finance, and BOJ Governor Mino erupted in 1990. Mino, criticizing the injustice of the excesses of the bubble, gained the moral upper hand. Proclaiming that he had never owned stock in his life, this clean pair of hands appeared to be creating fair policies that were good for Japan. The media portrayed him as Onihei of the Heisei era, a modern-day Robin Hood fighting for the rights of the poor.
1990年，日本财务省国际金融副大臣宇津美成与日本银行行长三重野成之间的公开争执爆发。三重野批评泡沫经济过度的不公，从而在道义上占据了上风。他宣称自己一生中从未拥有过股票，这双清洁的手似乎正在制定对日本有利的公平政策。媒体将他描绘为平成时代的鬼平，一个为穷人权利而战的现代罗宾汉。
Soon after his retirement from his position as governor in December 1994, Mino embarked on another campaign. Giving speeches to various associations and interest groups across the country, he lobbied for a change in the BOJ law. His line of argument was to subtly suggest that MOF pushed the BOJ into the wrong policies. To avoid such problems in the future, the BOJ needed to be given full legal independence. According to Mino, making central banks independent reflects the human wisdom that has been nurtured by history. Eventually, his case found a sympathetic reception from the coalition government under Prime Minister Hashimoto. Like many observers, its project team for administrative reform blamed the finance ministry for Japan's troubles of the 1990s and hence proposed to revoke many of the ministry's powers. This included the proposal to make the Bank of Japan independent and to take away the power of MOF to appoint and dismiss Bank of Japan officers. In 1997, the coalition submitted a bill to revise the Ministry of Finance Establishment Law and the Bank of Japan law to the Diet. The new BOJ law became effective in April 1998, stripping MOF of the power to set monetary policy and making the BOJ legally totally independent.
1994年12月，从行长职位退休后不久，三重也开始了另一场运动。 他在全国各地的各种协会和利益集团中发表演讲，游说改变日本银行法。他的论点微妙地暗示财务省将日本银行推向了错误的政策。为了避免将来出现这样的问题，日本银行需要获得完全的法律独立性。根据三重野的说法，使中央银行独立反映了历史所培养的人类智慧。最终，他的案例得到了在首相桥本纯的联合政府的同情接待。像许多观察家一样，其行政改革项目团队将日本90年代的麻烦归咎于财务省，因此提议撤销财务省的许多权利。这包括提议使日本银行独立，并剥夺财务省任命和解雇日本银行官员的权利。1997年，联盟向国会提交了修订财务省设立法和日本银行法的法案。新的日本银行法于1998年4月生效，剥夺了财务省制定货币政策的权利，使日本银行在法律上完全独立。
MOF tried to create a recovery.
财务省试图创造经济复苏。
There can be little doubt that the ministry wanted to create a recovery. In charge of the government budget, it was deeply averse to fiscal deficits and to increasing government debt. Deterioration in these indicators was seen as a blemish on MOF's image. A recession would reduce corporate, income, and sales taxes. It would boost unemployment benefits and social welfare expenditures. On top of that, politicians would demand government spending packages. 3 expenditures would balloon and revenues shrink, pushing the budget into deficit. Deficits are funded by bond issuance, and that is also not popular with MOF. Most of all, MOF did not like recessions because it was legally in charge of the economy. It would thus also get the blame for a recession. A long recession could cost it all its long-standing power.
毫无疑问，财务省希望创造经济复苏。作为政府预算的负责部门，他深深地反对财政赤字和增加政府债务。这些指标的恶化被视为财务省形象的瑕疵。经济衰退会减少公司收入和销售税，它会增加失业救济金和社会福利支出。除此之外，政治家们还会要求政府的支出计划。支出会激增，收入会缩减，推动预算赤字。赤字是通过发行债券来筹集资金的，这也不受财务省的欢迎。最重要的是，财务省不喜欢经济衰退，因为他在法律上负责经济，因此他也会因为经济衰退而受到指责。长期的经济衰退可能会让他失去所有长期的权利。
MOF's worst-case scenario occurred. The economy failed to recover. As a result, far-reaching administrative reform was implemented. The year 1998 went down in Japanese history as the year in which the Ministry of Finance lost its main power, its monopoly on budgeting. For the first time in the post-war era, it was politicians who drew up the stimulus packages. MOF lost control over banking supervision to an independent financial supervisory authority. It lost its licensing power thanks to the Big Bang deregulation program. Finally, it lost control over monetary policy to an independent Bank of Japan. To add insult to injury, in January 2001 MOF even lost its grand old name. Today, the Okurashio does not even exist.
财务省最糟糕的情况发生了，经济未能复苏，结果实施了深远的行政改革。1998年被载入日本历史，作为财务省失去其主要权力、预算垄断权的一年。这是战后时代的第一次，使政治家们制定刺激计划。财务省失去了对银行监管的控制权，这权力被独立的金融监管机构所取代。他因大规模放松监管计划而失去了许可权。最后，他失去了对货币政策的控制权，这权力被独立的日本银行所取代。更糟糕的是，2001年1月，财务省甚至失去了他的老名字。今天，大藏省甚至不存在。
While MOF clearly had a good incentive to create a recovery, the case is less clear-cut for the Bank of Japan. That is why it is time to take another look at the evidence.
虽然财务省显然有很好的动机去创造经济复苏，但对于日本银行来说，情况就不那么明确了。这就是为什么现在是时候再次审视证据了。
Re-examine the evidence, Dr. Watson.
重新审视证据，华生博士。
We are back in 1991. MOF, in the belief that the key monetary policy tool is the rate of interest, had been very unhappy with the BOJ's high interest rate policy and had been exerting influence to obtain a lower official discount rate. In 1991, the BOJ gave in and lowered the official discount rate for the first time in the 1990s. When the economy did not improve and, to the contrary, slowed down further, MOF used its legal status to lean on the Bank of Japan several more times to lower the discount rate. When the economy deteriorated further in 1992 and 1993, and strains in the financial markets had been reflected in sharp drops in the stock market, MOF's frequent fiscal stimulation packages seemed to betray signs of panic. Yet however badly the ministry wanted a recovery, it was elusive.
我们回到了1991年，财政部 MOF 坚信关键的货币政策工具是利率，对日本银行 BOJ 的高利率政策非常不满，并一直在施加影响以获得更低的官方贴现率。1991年，日本银行首次在90年代降低了官方贴现率。然而，当经济没有改善，反而进一步放缓时，财政部利用其法定地位，多次向日本银行施压，以降低贴现率。当经济在1992年和1993年进一步恶化，金融市场的压力反映在股市的急剧下跌上时，财政部频繁的财政刺激计划似乎显示出恐慌的迹象。然而，无论财政部多么渴望经济复苏，这都是难以实现的。
Throughout its post-war history, the Bank of Japan had relied on the quantity of credit to monitor and control the economy. From its experience of the 1950s and 1960s, when it kept interest rates especially low to ration credit and allocate funds to selected industries, the BOJ knew that with credit rationings, lower interest rates do not lead to an increase in the quantity of credit. In the 1990s, the bad debt problem paralyzed the banks and created severe credit rationing. Hence, the policy prescription must have been obvious to the Bank of Japan. Since credit can be created only by banks and the central bank, a decline in bank credit growth due to quantity rationing must be countered by an expansion in Bank of Japan credit creation. However, Bank of Japan credit creation did not increase significantly. To the contrary, as late as March 1995, the Bank of Japan withdrew money from the economy. The central bank failed to support government policy as the Bank of Japan law mandated.
在其战后历史中，日本银行一直依赖信贷数量来监控和控制经济。从1950年代和1960年代的经验中，日本银行在特别低的利率下配给信贷，并将资金分配给选定的行业，知道在信贷配给下，更低的利率并不会导致信贷数量的增加。在1990年代，不良债务问题使银行瘫痪，导致严重的信贷配给。因此，对日本银行来说，政策处方必须显而易见。由于信贷只能由银行和中央银行创造，由于数量配给导致的银行信贷增长下降，必须通过扩大日本银行的信贷创造来抵消。然而，日本银行的信贷创造并没有显著增加。相反，直到1995年3月，日本银行还从经济中撤出了资金。中央银行未能按照日本银行法的要求支持政府政策。
Fiscal stimulation neutralized.
财政刺激被中和。
The same fate awaited the government's fiscal policy. Between 1992 and 1994, for massive fiscal stimulus packages amounting to 45 trillion yen were added onto regular government spending. More than 100 trillion yen has been added in a string of further spending packages since. 4. The enormous size of the stimulation programs reflects just how desperately MOF and the politicians wanted a recovery. Once again, the goal eluded them. The problem was that fiscal spending was funded by bond issuance and the money largely taken from the private sector. Without simultaneous central bank or bank credit expansion, fiscal spending had to reduce private demand. Yet the Bank of Japan kept credit tight. Thus, the fiscal stimulus packages of the 1990s were wasted and merely increased government debt.
政府的财政政策也遭遇了同样的命运。在1992年至1994年间，4个总额达45万亿日元的大规模财政刺激计划被加入到常规政府支出中。此后的一系列进一步的支出计划中，又增加了超过100万亿日元。这些刺激计划的巨大规模反映了财政部和政治家们多么渴望经济复苏。然而，他们再次未能实现这个目标。问题在于，财政支出是通过发行债券，并主要从私人部门筹集资金来资助的。如果没有同时进行中央银行或银行的信贷扩张，财政支出就必须减少私人需求。然而，日本银行保持了信贷紧缩，因此 1990年代的财政刺激计划被浪费，只是增加了政府债务。
Why would MOF let the Bank of Japan get away with failing to support its policies? The answer seems to be that MOF officials believed that they were in control of monetary policy, since they could manipulate interest rates, fiscal policy, and exchange rate policy. The old generation of MOF control bureaucrats, who had briefly competed with the Bank of Japan for increasing credit creation in the early post-war era, had long gone. The bureaucrats of the Economic Stabilization Board had been dissipated and their institutional knowledge lost. Neoclassical economics had become the mainstream approach also at Japanese universities. Credit creation was not taught anymore. The knowledge existed inside the Bank of Japan, but the central bank failed to share it with MOF or the general public. To the contrary, Bank of Japan staff has spent considerable resources on publications and PR, telling the public that its policies are determined by manipulating interest rates, and such measures as credit are not interesting. 5 as a result. By the early 1980s, MOF was no longer concerned with the quantity of credit as a monetary policy tool.
为什么财政部会让日本银行不支持其政策而不受惩罚呢？答案似乎是，财政部官员们认为他们控制了货币政策，因为他们可以操纵利率、财政政策和汇率政策。在战后初期，与日本银行竞争增加信贷创造的财政部控制官僚的老一代已经不在了。经济稳定委员会的官僚已经消散，他们的机构知识已经丧失。新古典经济学也已经成为日本大学的主流方法。信贷创造已经不再被教授。这种知识存在于日本银行内部，但中央银行未能与财政部或公众分享。相反，日本银行的工作人员在出版物和公关上投入了大量的资源，告诉公众其政策是通过操纵利率来决定的，而像信贷这样的措施并不感兴趣。因此，到了1980年代初，财政部不再关心信贷数量作为货币政策工具。
The Battle of the Yen.
日元之战。
In late 1994, when both interest and fiscal policy had proven to be ineffective in stimulating the economy, MOF attempted to play its last trump card, exchange rate policy. The hope was that if the yen could be weakened, at least external demand could support the economy. The policy tool employed was so-called foreign exchange intervention, official purchases or sales of foreign exchange. According to the laws, the Bank of Japan merely acts as the executing organ, while MOF makes the decisions.
在1994年底，当利率和财政政策都未能有效刺激经济时，财政部试图打出其最后的王牌——汇率政策。他们希望，如果能够使日元贬值，至少外部需求能够支撑经济。他们采用的政策工具是所谓的外汇干预，即官方购买或出售外汇。根据法律，日本银行只是执行机构，而财政部则做出决策。
So the ministry ordered the Bank of Japan to sell large amounts of yen and buy US dollar assets, mainly US treasuries. In the second half of 1994, this amounted to US $7 billion. In February and March 1995, it reached US $19 billion, one of the largest quarterly foreign exchange interventions on record. The cumulative dollar purchases had boosted the official foreign exchange reserves to US $131 billion at the end of March 1995. The largest in the world. 6 The theory was that the demand for dollar assets would strengthen the dollar, hence weaken the yen. But again, MOF was disappointed. Despite such unprecedented intervention, the yen did not weaken. To the contrary, it strengthened. During the months from January to April 1995, the yen rose by 20%, hitting a historic high of yen 79.75/dollar on April 19, 1995. Such previously inconceivable yen strength dealt yet another blow to the battered economy.
因此，财政部命令日本银行大量出售日元并购买美元资产，主要是美国国债。在1994年下半年，这相当于70亿美元。到1995年2月和3月，这一数字达到了190亿美元，创下了历史上最大的季度外汇干预记录。累计的美元购买使得官方外汇储备在1995年3月底达到了1310亿美元，成为世界上最大的。理论上，对美元资产的需求会使美元升值，从而使日元贬值。但是，财政部再次失望了。尽管进行了如此前所未有的干预，日元并未贬值。相反， 它却升值了。在1995年1月至4月的几个月里，日元升值了 20%， 在1995年4月19日达到了历史最高的 79.75 日元美元。这种以前难以想象的日元强势，对已经疲软的经济造成了又一次打击。
Exchange rate theory built on interest rates.
基于利率的汇率理论。
Just what determines the yen-dollar exchange rate? The leading theoretical models of international capital flows and exchange rates are based on interest rates as the main determinant variable. If interest rates are higher or rising in the United States compared with Japan, money will flow from Japan to the United States, and this will weaken the yen and strengthen the dollar. Analysts and the financial press refer to this theory almost daily. Point 7.
究竟是什么决定了日元美元的汇率？国际资本流动和汇率的主要理论模型都是以利率作为主要决定变量。如果美国的利率高于或正在超过日本，资金就会从日本流向美国，这将使日元贬值，美元升值。分析师和金融媒体几乎每天都会提到这个理论。
Although the theory is so widespread that it has become common knowledge, frequently quoted by the financial press, it does not stand up to an empirical test. Figure 11.1 presents the yen-dollar exchange rate and the differential between 10-year government bond yields in the United States and Japan. One is tempted to conclude that things are working out. As can be seen, there seems to be a weak link between the two. Unfortunately, reality dares to ignore theory. Whenever the U.S.-Japan interest differential widens, i.e., U.S. interest rates are increasingly higher than Japanese rates, the dollar does not strengthen, but often even weakens. In the first half of the 1990s, for instance, the U.S.-Japan interest differential widened as U.S. rates rose and Japanese rates dropped. But instead of a stronger dollar, this was accompanied by a stronger yen, peaking in April 1995. Over the past 2 decades, the correlation between exchange rates and interest rates has not been supportive of the interest theory of exchange rate determination. The same result holds for short-term rates. Point 8.
尽管这个理论被广泛传播，已经成为常识，经常被金融媒体引用，但它并不能经受实证测试。图示 1.1 展示了日元美元汇率和美国与日本10年期政府债券收益率之间的差异。人们可能会得出结论，事情似乎在按计划进行。可以看到，两者之间似乎存在着微弱的联系。不幸的是，现实敢于无视理论。每当美日利差扩大，即美国利率比日本利率高，美元并未升值，而往往甚至贬值。例如，在1990年代上半年，美日利差扩大，因为美国利率上升，日本利率下降。但是，这并没有带来美元的升值，反而伴随着日元的升值，在1995年4月达到顶峰。在过去的20年里，汇率和利率之间的相关性并未支持利率决定汇率的理论。对于短期利率，结果也是如此。
Poring over the empirical literature on exchange rates, the largely unanimous conclusion of dozens of research papers is that exchange rates cannot be explained, let alone predicted. The random walk so far beats anyone's currency forecasts, we are told. In other words, there is no specific model or set of explanatory variables that predicts the exchange rate any better than the last few actual exchange rate observations. Economists do not yet understand the determinants of short to medium-run movements in exchange rates, concluded one experienced researcher. 9 What exchange rates will do in the future is anybody's guess.
在研究汇率的实证文献时，几十篇研究论文的结论基本一致，即汇率无法被解释，更不用说预测了。我们被告知，随机漫步迄今为止都超过了任何人的货币预测。换句话说，没有任何特定的模型或解释变量集合能比最近几次实际汇率观察更好地预测汇率。经济学家们还不了解决定短期至中期汇率变动的因素，一位经验丰富的研究者得出的结论。未来汇率会如何，任何人都无法预测。
Figure 11.1 yen/U.S. Dollar rate and U.S.-Japan interest differential.
图示 1.1 日元美元汇率与美日利差。
Source: Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System.
来源：美国联邦储备系统董事会。
Total more than the sum of its parts.
总和大于各部分之和。
Mainstream interest theory falls afoul of the fallacy of composition. When looking at only one investor, interest rates are a given variable that influences the behavior of this investor. Economists simply add up all investors. The fallacy lies in the aggregation. What is true for one individual investor cannot hold for all. If, for instance, all investors shift their portfolios in favor of one specific asset, interest rates will be affected. For all investors in the United States and Japan taken together, the interest rate differential is not a given, external variable. To the contrary, it is the result of everybody's investment activity. Point 10. Put simply, all the information that is in the bond markets, and hence interest rates, is also at any moment in time in the foreign exchange markets. Both are driven by a third factor, and one cannot explain the other. A model based largely on interest rate differentials therefore can't have much predictive power.
主流利率理论陷入了构成谬误。当只看一个投资者时，利率是影响这个投资者行为的给定变量。经济学家只是将所有投资者加起来。谬误在于聚合。对于一个单独的投资者来说是真实的，对所有人来说就不一定了。例如，如果所有投资者都将他们的投资组合转向一个特定的资产，利率将会受到影响。对于美国和日本的所有投资者来说，利差并不是一个给定的外部的变量，相反，它是每个人投资活动的结果。简单来说，债券市场因此也是利率中的所有信息在任何时刻都在外汇市场中，两者都受到第三个因素的驱动，一个不能解释另一个。因此，一个主要基于利差的模型预测力不会很强。
We have already found in Chapter 4 that due to unrealistic assumptions, perfect information, and the fallacy of composition, modern economic theory has misguidedly placed the emphasis on the price of money, the interest rate. In reality, the most important determinant is the quantity of new purchasing power. Without perfect information, markets cannot be expected to be in equilibrium. Instead, they are likely to be quantity rationed. Hence, quantities determine the outcome, not prices. We should expect the same to hold for exchange rates. Instead of the interest differential, they should be determined by the differential in credit creation. Put simply, if the BOJ prints yen faster than the Fed is printing dollars, then the yen should be expected to fall and the dollar to rise. 11 While foreign exchange dealers focused on every word uttered by Isaac Yen Sakakibara of the Ministry of Finance, the yen-dollar rate has been mainly controlled by the Bank of Japan and the Fed.
我们已经在第4章中发现，由于不切实际的假设、完全信息和构成谬误，现代经济理论错误地将重点放在了货币的价格、利率上。实际上，最重要的决定因素是新购买力的数量。没有完全的信息，市场不能期望达到均衡。相反，它们可能会受到数量配给的影响。因此，数量决定了结果，而不是价格。我们应该期望汇率也是如此。汇率应该由信贷创造的差异决定，而不是利差。简单来说，如果日本银行比美联储更快地印制日元，那么日元应该预期会下跌，美元会上涨。尽管外汇交易商关注财政省的神元英资，又名日元说的每一个字，但日元美元汇率主要由日本银行和美联储控制。
BOJ and Fed in control of yen-dollar rate.
日本银行和美联储控制日元美元汇率。
In Figure 11.2, we have calculated the difference between the credit creation of the Fed and the BOJ and plotted it against the change in the exchange rate. As can be seen, the exchange rate does not follow a random walk, but is correlated with the quantity of credit creation by the central banks. Their relative credit creation seems to explain exchange rates over the last 20 years reasonably well. From 1990 onward, the yen strengthened and the dollar weakened. At the time, the U.S. Fed created dollars rapidly to reflate the U.S. economy. The Bank of Japan did the opposite, to prick the bubble. With fewer yen and more dollars, the dollar weakened and the yen strengthened. The same happened again in early 1995. It also held for the period of extraordinary yen weakness in 1998 and the subsequent strengthening in 1999. Each time, the relative credit creation of the central banks to a large extent explained and predicted the exchange rate.
在图示 1.2 中，我们计算了美联储和日本银行的信贷创造之间的差异，并将其与汇率变动进行了对比。可以看出，汇率并非随机波动，而是与中央银行的信贷创造量有关。他们的相对信贷创造似乎在过去20年里对汇率有着合理的解释。 从1990年开始，日元升值，美元贬值。当时，美联储快速创造美元以重振美国经济，日本银行则做了相反的事情，以刺破泡沫。由于日元减少和美元增加，美元贬值，日元升值。同样的情况在1995年初再次发生，这也适用于1998年日元特别疲软和1999年随后增强的时期。每次，中央银行的相对信贷创造在很大程度上解释并预测了汇率。
It is now time to go back to the mysterious episode of March and April 1995, when the yen soared to a record high. Was this primarily due to the policies taken by the Fed, or was it more the result of the policies taken by the Bank of Japan? We know that the foreign exchange intervention of the Bank of Japan, as ordered by the Ministry of Finance, had reached double-digit billion-dollar figures. So surely the Bank of Japan was creating a lot of yen?
现在是时候回到1995年3月和4月神秘的一段时间，当时日元飙升至历史最高点。这主要是由于美联储的政策，还是更多的是由于日本银行的政策？我们知道，日本财政部下令的日本银行的外汇干预已经达到了10亿美元的双位数。那么，日本银行肯定创造了大量的日元吗？
To find the perpetrator, we have broken the index into its two components, Fed credit creation and BOJ credit creation, figure 11.3. We find that the Fed relatively consistently reduced its dollar creation between 1993 and 1996. That alone would tend to weaken the yen. So the yen strength of 1995 was not due to the Fed's actions. A look at the BOJ's credit creation uncovers the smoking gun. Net credit creation by the Japanese central bank dropped sharply from August 1994 onward. The tightening became worse and worse, culminating in the events of March 1995. Despite the painful recession and the desperate attempts by MOF to weaken the yen, the Bank of Japan actually reduced credit in this month. It withdrew money from the economy. As our exchange rate model demonstrates, this sudden reduction in yen creation meant that the yen had to strengthen drastically relative to the dollar. Had the Bank of Japan wished to support government policy and weaken the yen, it would only have had to increase its credit creation. Yet it did the opposite. Since the net credit creation of the Bank of Japan is a policy variable that the Bank of Japan can change at will, we have established that the Bank of Japan was directly responsible for the sudden surge of the yen to yen 79.75/dollar on April 19, 1995.
为了找到罪魁祸首，我们将指数分解为两个组成部分：美联储的信贷创造和日本银行的信贷创造。图 11.3。我们发现，美联储在1993年至1996年间相对稳定地减少了其美元创造，这本身就会使日元走弱。所以，1995年的日元强势并非由于美联储的行动。看一看日本银行的信贷创造，就能发现真凶。日本中央银行的净信贷创造从1994年8月开始急剧下降，紧缩越来越严重，最终在1995年3月达到顶峰。尽管经济衰退严重，财政部也在拼命试图使日元贬值，但日本银行在这个月实际上减少了信贷，它从经济中撤回了资金。正如我们的汇率模型所示，这种突然的日元创造减少意味着日元必须相对于美元大幅升值。如果日本银行希望支持政府政策并使日元贬值，它只需要增加其信贷创造。然而，它却做了相反的事情。由于日本银行的净信贷创造是日本银行可以随意改变的政策变量，我们已经确定日本银行直接负责了1995年4月19日日元对美元的突然飙升至 79.75 日元美元。
Figure 11.2 Relative credit creation by Federal Reserve and Bank of Japan, Fed, BOJ, LI, and the yen/U.S. dollar rate.
图 11.2 美联储和日本银行的相对信贷创造，美联储日本银行 LLI 和日元美元汇率。
Source: Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Bank of Japan.
来源：美国联邦储备系统董事会日本银行。
Figure 11.3 Credit creation by Bank of Japan and Federal Reserve, as measured by Profit Research Center's leading liquidity indices.
图 11.3 日本银行和美联储的信贷创造由 Profit Research Center 的领先流动性指数测量。
Source: Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Bank of Japan. Profit Research Center Ltd.
来源：美国联邦储备系统理事会、日本银行、利润研究中心有限公司。
Ma fooled by Forex interventions.
财政部被外汇干预所蒙蔽。
How could the Bank of Japan get away with such a policy? Again, lack of knowledge of the facts by the Ministry of Finance seems to have been the reason. The bureaucrats of the International Finance Bureau in the Ministry of Finance may have believed that they were firmly in control of exchange rate policy because they decide the official foreign exchange intervention. Their statements in public, including those by Sakakibara, certainly seem to suggest that. But what actually moves the exchange rate is the net credit creation of the central banks. That is determined by the total sum of all transactions of each central bank. Foreign exchange intervention represents merely one part of this.
日本银行如何能够实施这样的政策呢？在此，财政部对事实的无知似乎是原因。财政部国际金融局的官僚们可能相信他们对汇率政策有着坚实的控制，因为他们决定了官方的外汇干预。他们在公开场合的声明，包括神元的声明，似乎确实暗示了这一点。但实际上，影响汇率的是中央银行的净信贷创造。这是由每个中央银行的所有交易总和决定的，外汇干预只是其中的一部分。
When the BOJ was told by MOF to buy US dollars, it went ahead and did so. MOF perhaps assumed that the BOJ would print the yen needed to buy US dollars or US treasuries and that thus the yen would weaken. But this is not necessarily the case. In simple terms, the BOJ sold government bonds or other paper to investors in the domestic economy and used the proceeds to implement the foreign exchange intervention. Instead of printing the money, it took it from the economy. Economists call such an operation sterilization. Since the BOJ's credit creation does not rise under such a policy, the yen will not weaken. 12.
当日本银行被财政部指示购买美元时，它就会这样做。财政部可能认为日本银行会印制需要购买美元或美国国债的日元，从而使日元贬值。但这并不一定是这样。简单来说，日本银行向国内经济的投资者出售政府债券或其他票据，并用收入来实施外汇干预。它并没有印制钱，而是从经济中获取。经济学家称这样的操作为消毒。由于日本银行的信贷创造在这样的政策下不会增加，日元不会贬值。
In February and March 1995, when MOF ordered the BOJ to buy US $20 billion worth of US paper, the BOJ oversterilized. By withdrawing more money from the economy than was needed for the foreign exchange intervention ordered by MOF. Net credit shrank in March 1995, and the yen shot up to its record high.
1995年2月和3月，当财政部命令日本银行购买价值200亿美元的美国票据时，日本银行通过从经济中提取的资金超过了财政部命令的外汇干预所需的金额，进行了超额消毒。1995年3月，净信贷收缩，日元升至历史最高点。
A replay of the battle between MOF and the BOJ over the yen exchange rate occurred in 1999. Having fallen dramatically in 1998, the yen was widely expected to remain weak in the following year. However, the Bank of Japan withdrew credit from the economy at a record pace. This credit shrinkage strengthened the yen to close to yen 100/dollar by the end of 1999, despite new record foreign exchange interventions ordered by MOF. The Bank of Japan again oversterilized them.
1999年，财政部和日本银行之间关于日元汇率的争斗再次上演。日元在1998年大幅下跌后，预计在次年将继续疲软。然而，日本银行以创纪录的速度从经济中撤出信贷。尽管财政部下达了新的创纪录的外汇干预指令，但这种信贷收缩使日元在1999年底接近每美元100日元的水平。日本银行再次进行了超额消毒。
Misery created by the BOJ.
日本央行制造的苦难。
Perhaps the Bank of Japan deemed the economy strong enough. In the first quarter of 1995, unemployment had reached a post-war high, creating human misery. The actual number of jobless probably topped 5 million people in early 1996.13, that is the size of the whole population of Denmark. Recession-related suicides jumped to a post-war high as well. Meanwhile, the banking system was still in deep trouble. Public money was not forthcoming, as even the bailout of the tiny Jusen housing loan companies met fierce public resistance. Fiscal stimulation was wasted, as it was not backed by money creation. To pay back the record-high debt resulting from it, future generations will be burdened with rising taxes. Meanwhile, the low-interest rate policy, which could be avoided by increasing the quantity of credit creation, transferred wealth from savers to the banks. The total sum of transferred purchasing power likely exceeded 100 trillion yen, more than the annual GDP of the United Kingdom.
或许日本央行认为经济已经足够强大。1995年第一季度，失业率达到了战后最高水平，造成了人类的苦难。实际的失业人数可能在1996年初超过了500万人，13这相当于整个丹麦的人口。与此同时，由于经济衰退，自杀率也达到了战后最高水平。与此同时，银行系统仍然处于深重的困境。公共资金并未流入，即使是对微小的居民住房贷款公司的救助，也遭到了公众的激烈反对。财政刺激被浪费，因为它没有得到货币创造的支持。为了偿还由此产生的创纪录的高债务，未来的几代人将被迫承担增加的税收。与此同时，通过增加信贷创造量可以避免的低利率政策，将财富从储户转移到了银行。转移的购买力总额可能超过了100万亿日元，超过了英国的年度 GDP。
Was the BOJ afraid of inflation?
日本央行害怕通胀吗？
Why did the BOJ for so many years fail to implement the most obvious, simplest, and most suitable policy, namely, to print money? The first explanation might be that the Bank of Japan did not realize it was the right policy. Governor Mino's declared policy aim in 1990 was to fight asset price inflation. The BOJ might still have been fighting yesterday's war, though the economy was already in the grip of deflation. But this explanation is not plausible. By 1992, it had already become painfully clear that asset prices were falling sharply. Moreover, there was never a danger of consumer price or wholesale price inflation. Inflationary pressures can come about only when credit creation is pushing the economy beyond its full capacity and when unemployment is at a very low level. But to the contrary, capacity utilization had been falling, inventories were rising, and many factories had been idle for much of the recession. With unemployment at post-war highs, it defies logic to explain the BOJ's tight money policy by a fear of inflation.
为什么日本央行在这么多年里都没有实施最明显、最简单、最适合的政策即印钞？第一个解释可能是日本央行没有意识到这是正确的政策。1990年，央行行长三重野的公开政策目标是打击资产价格通胀。尽管经济已经陷入了通缩，日本央行可能仍在打昨天的战争，但这个解释并不合理。到1992年，资产价格急剧下跌已经变得痛苦的清楚。此外，消费价格或批发价格通胀从未构成威胁。只有当信贷创造推动经济超过其全部能力，且失业率处于非常低的水平时，才可能产生通胀压力。但相反，产能利用率一直在下降，库存在增加，许多工厂在经济衰退期间大部分时间都处于闲置状态。在失业率达到战后最高水平的情况下，用通胀恐惧来解释日本央行的紧缩货币政策是不合逻辑的。
Is the BOJ just incompetent?
日本央行只是无能吗？
Could the BOJ's policies simply be due to incompetence? If one uses some of the publications by the Bank of Japan as an indication, then one might indeed be tempted to come to this conclusion. Many of its studies use a highly stylized and abstract form of neoclassical economics, which at the same time is based on oversimplifying, counterfactual assumptions about reality. Moreover, BOJ officials have repeatedly published research that claims that the Bank of Japan cannot control the money supply. However, we saw in earlier chapters that while the central bank's injections of funds into the interbank market may be outside its control, this is not true for all its transactions. While these models may well reflect the views of hired economists trained in neoclassical economics, the likelihood is that they are far removed from any decision-making or the type of work experience that would familiarize them with credit creation, such as at the banking department. The history of the BOJ suggests that the decision-makers know very well from 5 decades of institutional experience that the quantity of credit creation determines the state of the economy and the exchange rate. I, for my part, have met staff members who were not on the research side, And they told me that their economists did not know about the true policy implementation, which is based on credit creation. Point 14.
日本央行的政策是否仅仅是因为无能？如果以日本央行的一些出版物为指示，那么人们可能会被诱导得出这个结论。他的许多研究使用了高度抽象和简化的新古典经济学形式，同时基于对现实的过度简化和反事实的假设。此外，日本央行的官员们反复发表研究，声称日本央行无法控制货币供应。然而，我们在前面的章节中看到，虽然中央银行向银行间市场注入资金可能超出了其控制范围，但这并不适用于所有的交易。虽然这些模型可能很好地反映了受过新古典经济学训练的雇佣经济学家的观点，但他们很可能与任何决策制定或使他们熟悉信贷创造的工作经验相去甚远，比如在银行部门。日本央行的历史表明，决策者从50年的机构经验中非常清楚地知道，信贷创造的数量决定了经济和汇率的状态。至于我见过一些不在研究方面的工作人员，他们告诉我，他们的经济学家并不了解真正的政策实施，这是基于信贷创造的。14.
BOJ staff would only have to reflect on the successful reflation of 1975, when Japan's first boom-bust recession was ended by aggressive credit creation by the Bank of Japan. The man in charge of increasing the quantity of credit at the time, the head of the banking department, was an up-and-coming young central banker named Yasushi Mino. Central bankers could also have recalled their actions during the even more dramatic banking problem and reflation after 1945.
日本银行的工作人员只需要回顾一下1975年的成功通胀，当时日本的第一次繁荣衰退经济周期被日本银行积极的信贷创造所终结。当时负责增加信贷数量的人，银行部门的负责人是一位正在崭露头角的年轻中央银行家，名叫三重野康。中央银行家们也可能回忆起他们在1945年之后更为戏剧性的银行问题和通胀行动。
BOJ can't plead ignorance.
日本银行不能以无知为借口。
There is another reason why since 1991 the Bank of Japan must have been aware of the solution to Japan's looming troubles. In 1990, the United States faced a problem similar to Japan's, in which a boom funded by excessive credit creation had turned into a bust. Huge bad debts paralyzed the banking system. The ensuing credit reduction brought the wheels of the non-financial economy to an abrupt halt. In 1991, real GDP contracted by approximately 1%. How long this recession was going to last was in the hands of one institution, the Federal Reserve. It needed to print money. That is what it did from 1990 onward. Credit creation rose, and the United States moved out of the recession faster than expected.
自1991年以来，日本银行必须已经意识到解决日本即将出现的问题的解决方案，这是另一个原因。1990年，美国面临着与日本类似的问题，其中由过度信贷创造资助的繁荣已经转变为衰退。巨额的不良债务使银行系统瘫痪，随后的信贷减少使非金融经济的运转突然停止。1991年，实际 GDP 收缩了大约1%。这次衰退将持续多久，取决于一个机构——美联储。它需要印钞，这就是它从1990年开始所做的。信贷创造增加，美国比预期更快地走出了衰退。
Then the Fed embarked on the second phase of its reflation program, its clandestine bank bailout. It transferred money to banks by helping them create substantial profits in the bond market. Thanks partly to these profits, banks could afford to write off bad debts and begin to create credit again. This way, the Fed quickly reflated the economy. While most observers remained pessimistic until early 1994, the U.S. economy had already fully recovered by 1992. By acting immediately, the Fed had ended the U.S. banking crisis and recession within a year. While the Fed reflated, the Bank of Japan did not. Yet at the time, the BOJ studied the Fed's actions in detail. Point 15 finally. There are testimonies by leading Bank of Japan staff indicating that they knew early on what the problems were. Point 16. It is therefore not plausible to argue that the Bank of Japan was unaware that printing money and creating a bond market boom was the right policy to end the recession.
然后，美联储开始了其通胀计划的第二阶段，其秘密的银行救助行动。他通过帮助他们在债券市场创造大量利润，将资金转移到银行。 部分归功于这些利润，银行能够负担得起减记不良债务，并开始再次创造信贷。这样，美联储迅速地通胀了经济。虽然大多数观察者直到1994年初仍然持悲观态度，但美国经济在1992年已经完全恢复。美联储立即采取行动，使美国的银行危机和衰退在1年内结束。然而，当美联储在通胀时，日本银行并未这样做。然而，当时日本银行详细研究了美联储的行动。最后，日本银行的主要工作人员的证词表明，他们早就知道问题在哪里。因此，认为日本银行不知道印钞和创造债券市场繁荣是结束衰退的正确政策是不合理的。
Since its actions were consistent for many years from 1990 to 1997, with another significant tightening in 1999, there also can be no argument that BOJ policy was just a temporary slip-up. There is no evidence to support the hypothesis of irrationality on behalf of the central bank.
由于其行动多年来一直保持一致，从1990年到1997年，1999年又有一次重大的紧缩，因此也不能认为日本银行的政策只是一次临时的失误。没有证据支持中央银行行为不理性的假设。
So why didn't the Bank of Japan reflate in 1993 or in 1994? Why did it disrupt the reflation policies of the democratically elected government and its Ministry of Finance? The quantity of credit creation by the central bank is fully decided by the Bank of Japan. The actions of the BOJ do not support the hypothesis that the BOJ wanted to create a recovery. The principle of revealed preference, used by economists, including Bank of Japan economists in their models, suggests that the BOJ has revealed its preference for tight credit creation and the long recession that it entailed. However, it is hard to believe that the central bank would purposely want to prolong the recession. To examine this issue, it is necessary to go back to the events of the 1980s. These are the root cause of the recession, and they may provide further clues.
那么，为什么日本银行在1993年或1994年没有通胀呢？为什么它要破坏民主选举的政府及其财政部的通胀政策？中央银行创造的信贷数量完全由日本银行决定。日本银行的行动并不支持日本银行希望创造复苏的假设。经济学家使用的皆是偏好原则，包括日本银行的经济学家在他们的模型中使用的，表明日本银行已经揭示了其对紧缩信贷创造以及它所带来的长期衰退的偏好。然而，很难相信中央银行会故意想要延长衰退。要检查这个问题，需要回到1980年代的事件。这些是衰退的根本原因，它们可能会提供更多的线索。